Welcome everyone, or welcome back if you were here already this morning. My name is Rik Peels and I'm the PI of the Extreme Beliefs Project. And before we start the conference, I would like to share a couple of thoughts on the conference and on the project that is behind the conference. And in order to do so, I would like to share my screen. So let me see whether this works. Showing up, so I think it works, right? All right, so at the Free University in Amsterdam, we have this project on extreme beliefs, subtitled Epistemology and the Ethics of Fundamentalism. So this conference on mapping those extreme beliefs is organized by the team. And the basic idea of the project is that we want to bring philosophical tools to a largely empirical and historical debate. So the debate on extremism, fundamentalism, terrorism, fanaticism, radicalism, and related notions. So earlier today, we had this book symposium on this book that I'm holding in my hand now by Kassam, which provides a philosophical analysis of extremism and related notions, actually. And as we saw earlier this morning, it squares well with certain ideas in the project, such as the first-person perspective, the eye on the extremist belief, seeking conceptual grip, and understanding these notions in relation to one another. If you weren't able to attend the book symposium, it has been recorded and will soon be shared on the website, www.extremebeliefs.com, so you can look it up later. Now, a few more thoughts on the project itself. So here's a rather horrible image from a few years ago to women who were assaulted in a bus or a metro in London. When we use the term extremism or terrorism, we often think straight away of such extreme physical violence. But of course, there are other ways in which extremism and fundamentalism can be harmful. For instance, this is the Cornelius Haga school in Amsterdam, which was accused of indoctrinating its students and a non-healthy ideological influence. Of course, this is true for Islamism, but there are other varieties of extremism, such as neo-fascism or neo-Nazism, as we have a look at this morning, ethno or Hindu ethno-nationalism, extreme leftism or left-wing extremism, that might be mentalism as equivalents. There are lots of varieties, and the aim of this project is to have a look at the commonalities and differences rather than entirely zoom in on specific one. Right, here's the basic idea. There's been much attention in the literature for fundamentalist action, similarly for extremist action, and so on, but it's been largely empirical and historical so far. There's been less attention for the underlying, in the sense of the word, fundamentalist beliefs and other extreme beliefs. Right, so I said in a sense because these actions are not like straight away caused by beliefs. There's a complex interaction, and sometimes beliefs are not even that important. Sometimes they are. So this project, as I said, aims to bring philosophical sources such as resources like conceptual research, conceptual analysis, and normative research like reflective equilibrium and ethics to this debate by studying these beliefs and the way they interact with various fundamentalists and other extreme actions. This leads to research questions such as, these are just a couple of examples, what are fundamentalist beliefs, and similarly for extremist beliefs, for instance, how do those of an individual relate to those of the group? When is one excused for fundamentalist beliefs? So when, for instance, is indoctrination a proper excuse, and when is it not? How do first-person explanations, so those in terms of people's subjectivities, their beliefs, their narratives, their reasons, their preoccupations, relate to third-person explanations, so those in terms of economic factors, social factors, political ones, cultural ones, maybe medical or psychiatric ones? How do those relate to one another, and can they be integrated? And what is the relation between belief and behavior across such phenomena as fundamentalism, terrorism, and also conspiracy thinking? So I think we've seen in policy lately that people are increasingly paying attention to the two in relation to one another, so conspiracy thinking and extremism, for instance. And we've come up with hypotheses such as fundamentalists are usually healthy, normal, rational people, of course with problematic ideas and behavior, but that's one of the leading hypotheses. We ought to take the reasons, beliefs, narratives, and so on of fundamentalists seriously. In order to explain and understand, possibly prevent fundamentalism, we need to integrate first and third-person explanations, and we need obviously combined work across these disciplines or fields to do so. Here's the team. So a couple of them are here in the room, a couple of them are at home. Are from me, and Iman is student assistant, Nora has PhD, and Chris and Nomi as postdocs, and then Clyde is here as well. The couple of other external PhDs, various associate members like Ruth as this morning, and interns as well. And of course, there are further people involved. All right, what can you expect from us apart from this particular event? Of course, academic books, articles, more applied books. Pieces as well, blogs and so on. Workshops and conferences like these. Lectures, they will be recorded and shared on the website. Book symposia, interviews, videos, involvement in policy making, maybe relevant to some of you. So those things you can expect from us, and the idea is that they will all be shared on the website, so probably accessible for everyone who's interested in this. Now, a couple of words on the purpose of what I consider to be the purpose of this conference. Should consistently use the right. So I think one important aim for today and tomorrow is to develop sound definitions of extremism, fanaticism, and fundamentalism. And of course, that comes with reflection on what a sound definition is, what criteria desiderata it should meet. Also explore these definitional issues in relation to issues of normativity, as we did earlier this morning. So to what extent are these notions like extremism inherently normative? And what does that mean for instance, quantitative and qualitative research, for instance, when it comes to operationalization or context relativity? Also, how do these phenomena relate to one another? Can we map how they relate, and what does that mean for research, for policy, and for the public debate? These are some of the main issues that I consider to be purposes for this workshop. And maybe I'd like to emphasize that it is a workshop, and that means that it's work in progress. So may I invite all of us to present even ideas that are somewhat rough. The idea is to present them and to improve the debate, right? And sometimes that's best done by leveling ideas that are not yet in an entirely polished and finished state. A few practical announcements before we get started. Latest conference booklet is online, so on the website. Please check that one because there was a slight change in the schedule. So for today we have Tahir and Abbas's lecture, and then the one by Lazar. And then we've got the Avatar virtual meeting. And tomorrow we have the other lectures, so please check the schedule. The videos are all recorded. If you don't feel happy for some reason or other being recorded, please switch off the camera. And if you have any questions, you can either put them in the chat or you can just ask them live with your camera on, up to you. If you've got any urgent questions, shoot an email to Iman at this email address. And of course, you can go to the website to later on to check any videos, recordings. That's basically what I wanted to say in advance by way of short intro. If there are no urgent issues, I would like to introduce our next speaker. There are no urgent issues? Wonderful. All right. Our next speaker is someone who already spoke this morning, Tahir Abbas, from the University of Leiden. He's an associate professor in terrorism and political violence at the well-known Institute of Security and Global Affairs. He did a PhD in ethnic relations, and did it at the University of Warwick, 2001. I see the PowerPoint is already showing up. He's written extensively, really, on issues such as Islamophobia, radicalization, gender and violence, intergenerational transmission of Islamism, ethnic relations, and so on. He's the author, I found out, of 14 books, or if you count them differently, even 18, and over 70 peer-reviewed articles. And one of his latest books is Islamophobia and Radicalization, a Vicious Cycle with OUP back in 2000. So today he's going to speak on understanding Islamism and extremism. Thank you so much for being with us again today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rik. Thank you so much, colleagues. Thank you for this opportunity to be with you here today. So I think I've got about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. So I'll try to whiz through some of my ideas as reasonably swiftly as possible, and hopefully set some ground for further discussion around thinking through extremism. So just
quickly, you've got a little bit more time if you want to, because there's an hour in total. So
sure. Yeah, plenty of time indeed then. Just by way of introduction, I'm the scientific coordinator of the DRIVE project, which is looking at radicalization in the context of social exclusion of far-right and Islamist groups in Northwest Europe. We're just at the end of the first year. We're preparing our research instruments with the view to getting into the field in early January, which is a little bit of a tricky challenge given the ongoing problems of COVID, but we're going to find ways through it. Certainly interviewing online isn't an impossibility these days. In fact, it can be quite effective if done well, but there are all sorts of ethical challenges, least alone the fact that we're working with a public mental health perspective in terms of an intervention, while the vast majority of the 21 people or so in the project are social scientists and humanities folk. So sometimes we don't know what language to speak with each other, but that's part of making science, as it were. So today, I want to talk about how we think about Islamism as a way in which we think about extremism. And I think this is important given that there's quite a lot of heat on the subject across Western Europe. There has been for quite some time. The events of 9/11 have opened the floodgate in relation to understanding, delivering policy solutions to what we might describe as violent extremism in the name of Islam. So we have to be careful about terminologies here, because often there's a lot of Arabic words thrown about, but without real full understanding of their application and meaning. I, as a social scientist, I want to try and introduce grounded understandings of these problems so that we can look at workable solutions that can feed into policy, as well as the usual gambit, the usual gamut of publications in various fields. So in this presentation, I'm sort of effectively summarizing the course I just taught to this master's students on how to understand extremism in a global context vis-a-vis the question of Islamism. And so without making it too obvious and sounding that I'm sort of teaching grandmother to suck eggs, sometimes a lot of our students don't really know much of the history of Islam per se. They don't really have a grounding in understanding the developments to the Islamic intellectual, cultural, political, ethnic landscape of the world today as a consequence of past events, realities, exchanges, principally with Europe. So I don't want to go into this too much detail, but for sure, we can think about some of the problems that emerged in Islam at the very beginning of the foundations of Islam itself. When we talk about fitna, which is not the name of a Geertz Wilders movie, fitna effectively means discord. And some of this discord occurred very early on in the emergence of concepts of takfirism. So takfirism is the idea of killing other Muslims in the name of Islam. So one might argue, well, there we are. There's the problem and the solution. If we think that there's some inherent tendency in a particular religion to reveal itself when certain buttons are pressed, the problem's in the inherent tendencies. What I'm trying to argue, and what my work has been trying to push on, is that in fact there are external challenges that are often more important in determining how we can think about what are fundamental beliefs turning into fundamental action. And so much so that we don't necessarily need fundamental beliefs to introduce fundamental action, because the effect of the external factors can be so significant and so great in our mobilization and motivation to extremism and violence. As mentioned this morning, and I think as we continue our conversations, no extremism occurs in a vacuum. There have to be various contextual factors, and that can be at the level of the individual, that can be at the level of the macro dimensions in which the individual finds themselves. There are also these meso-level interactions that are important to think about. So if we think as the macro as the push factors, the structural factors, and the micro as pull, there's something happening at the level of the individual, which might be described as the meso level. So that's where a lot of our understandings around what is driving extremism is likely to give us the most useful answers. But at the same time, we can take two extremists from the same backgrounds with the same motivations, put them in the same room, and yet they would be very different from each other, because there are always going to be individual level individual level dynamics that are important to bring out. Okay, so Islam emerges in the 7th century in no real sort of vacuum. We had fading empires, East and West, the Sassanids, the Romans, and of course, the Islamic mythology around this is that because it was so rightly guided and inspired that it was able to conquer the 4 corners of the world in the first 30 years. But in fact, neighboring countries were very weak, and the diplomatic as well as the military solutions that Islam provided at the time were seen as positive openings for Arab tribal communities and beyond as a form of support, control, authority, leadership in quite tremendous, deeply problematic, highly conflictual vacuums. We see the expansion of Islam, but we also see the period known as the Golden Age, which created science, art, philosophy, which is when we think about philosophy, my own discipline, sociology, Ibn Khaldun, and the founding principles of things like development, economics, exchange, theories of exchange, scientific method principles, the idea of the rise and fall of civilizations that we've seen periodically talked about all the way to Marx and in more recent times. And of course, the reasons why we see a decline are not necessarily because of some internal issues. There are external factors to consider. So if you see the 9th century as the peak, we can see beginnings of quite philosophical debate around meaning and place in terms of the role of Islam and within communities and societies. But we also have quite interesting arguments between key philosophers, key thinkers. And we also see the beginnings of things like the Renaissance through actors such as Averroes and Avicenna, as we run them in Arabic terms, Ibn Rushd and Ibn Said. All of this is important, quick history to underpin the fact that by the time we get to the 12th century, we get to some problems. And this is where we see the Mongols from the east, from the east, basically trashing everything in their wake, burning all that they could find, and basically not leaving much behind. And then the Crusades, it's the first one beginning in the 1098. So Islam is attacked, or it is being seized upon on either side. What does that do to Islam? It forms a kind of retreat, and this retreat leads into kind of puritanical thinking. We see some key figures, people like Ibn Taymiyyah in the 13th century. He was a well-known jurist, and he wrote about many different things, but we often think about the sort of the idea of jihad. And here, jihad is translated from its greater meaning, which is mastery of the ego, to its application in everyday settings, which is to defend one faith at all costs, even by way of military means. We often see that as the most common understanding, but in fact, it does have greater meaning elsewhere. And so the response to these external threats leads to a kind of retreat to something seen as purer and absolute. And obviously absolutism is a problem, whichever way we look at it. And that can emerge from various different strands of religion and politics today. So this idea that in order to protect Islam from external threats is to go back to something purer is a thread we see that finds itself all the way, translating all the way to current periods and times. In the 17th century, we talk about the role of al-Wahhab and the emergence of Wahhabism, and that's sort of the amalgamation of, again, purist thinking with a particular kind of authoritarian doctrine and quite strong divisions between what is the land of Islam and what is the land of the non-believer, etc. And these divisions have not just become ideological or ideational, they become practical and real world in terms of borders, boundaries, and defenses of those. And fast forwarding all the way to the end of the 19th century, well, before that, we obviously get colonialism. With colonialism, 80% of the world's Muslims are under colonial rule at one point. And the effect of that is to, in fact, push Muslims into a different kind of retreat and a reaction which is seen as reformist. So by the late 19th century, we have reformers who think about the need of technology, science, and modernity to help Islam come out of its being pushed inwards, whereas others would focus on a more literalist, revivalist perspective. And that has had its implications in terms of the kinds of extremism we see in the 20th century. So the 20th century is also the end of the Ottomans. and that's sort of the breakup of the Ottoman Empire and breaking up all of these Middle East nations with straight lines that don't really have actual boundaries, and breaking up ethnic cleavages and creating new problems and nation state models that are in fact still under test in the European context. And so with this breakup of the Ottoman Empire and the formations of Muslim states, particularly in the post-war period, post-1945 period, we see more by way of responses. And Qutbism, the work of Sayyid Qutb, was almost alongside, in parallel to that of Maulana Maududi in what would be Pakistan today. And so the Jamaati Islami groups are found in places like Pakistan, all the way across to the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And again, when we think of Qutbism, it was very influential across the Middle East. Qutb himself was a teacher who went to Oklahoma as part of an exchange visit. He was horrified by what he saw. Jalaliya, the idea of kind of the decadence and the hedonism of Western life, was seen as completely un-Islamic. And so in order to respond to that, a new vanguard, a new generation is important, and it's extended existing ideas of the other and the self with respect to the Islamic world and the non-Islamic world. We see the basis of some of the ideas of Qutbism in Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda, we know very well how it came about in terms of the remnants of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and beyond in terms of the Taliban, and we see now Taliban 2.0. Before we get to Taliban 2.0, we also have this gangster death cult known as Islamic State or Daesh or ISIL emerging in Iraq, Syria, which began life as Sunni rebel groups, armed, facilitated, logistically supported by Western allies who wanted to take these rebels to the front in terms of dismantling Assad. And that's the origins. I mean, this is well documented. Hillary Clinton has talked about this in interviews. Turkey, certainly also some of the Gulf states were implicated in making all of that happen. So the Islamic State was the sort of Al-Qaeda on turbo, but a very different kind of outlook in terms of a purist, nihilist, essentialized, utopian/dystopian worldview that inveigled vulnerable and strong minds to that landscape. We're talking 300 from the Dutch context, mostly from the southeast of The Hague, which are some of the most ethnically concentrated parts of the country. This also includes Denmark, where in one area of our research fieldwork site, 25 out of 29 come out of one sort of housing block. It's sort of what's regarded as the ghetto in Danish policy language. So we see this Islamism, which is this politicization of Islam to meet Islam's objectives as determined by those who would do so. And of course, the problem here is that Islamism is a spectrum. There is the violent and the non-violent, the quietist, purists, and the non-violent, and of course the aggressive. And this is where we need to obviously be sensitive, because in many ways, some of these concepts around things like Salafism are used, bounded about by state discourses, and yet there's really very little appreciation. For example, the Dutch government would say there are 500 dangerous Salafists in the country, but that's a gross exaggeration. The reality is there's probably no more than 10 or 12 who might be dangerous, and they don't operate or come together in our localized settings. They do so very much under the radar, because Muslim extremists, for want of a better term, are heavily surveilled, heavily securitized online and real world. And so any desire to pop up and show themselves is going to be met with the full force of the state, full arm of the law. So in terms of the Islamist doctrine, it's wide, it's spread out across a landscape that is everything from non-violent, just anti-democratic, don't really want to take part in society, but no threat to anybody else, to all the way to actively mobilizing into acts of violence. And of course, these are the dangerous kinds, and we do have to do something meaningful in terms of preventing those kinds of things from bearing fruit. So that's obviously important, and counterterrorism has a role behind the scenes, less so in front of the scenes. In front of the scene, in terms of prevent policy, where we use the community as a form of surveillance, doesn't really work. It has a very detrimental effect. It does the opposite of what prevent tries to do. Okay, there's a sort of potted history of the sort of exposition of Islamism. What does that mean for Muslims in Europe? Well, we have 30 to 35 million Muslim minorities in Western Europe, mostly as a result of post-war migration into towns and cities that needed people in the labor markets in certain sectors as engineering, vehicle manufacturing, plant machinery, tools, manufacturing, and so on. And these were declining industrial sectors that indigenous populations didn't want to work in. So the low-paid, unwanted, dirty jobs fell to the hands of the once colonized, predominantly the once colonized. We're talking Moroccans in the context of Belgium, here in the Netherlands, in France specifically. We're talking South Asians in the case of the UK. With Turks and Germany, there was more of a bilateral understanding that the sort of Anatolian car workers were here employed by the likes of BMW, who created housing for them next to the factories, in fact, with the view that a lot of these migrant populations would disappear as soon as the jobs disappeared. And the jobs did disappear because of deindustrialization and internationalization of capital and labor, what we might call globalization today. And the introduction of technology. You don't need men to make cars anymore, you need robots to do it. And they don't go on strike, they don't demand high wages. So this migration problem, in terms of what we think of today as segregation or parallel lives, in terms of various right-wing discourses, are a function of downward social mobility, are a problem of discrimination in the labor markets and being pegged in due to housing policy, whether it's private or public. It's not out of choice. People think that people want to live parallel lives because they somehow think themselves as superior, or think of themselves as distinct, or their relations with the majority is unbreachable due to various cultural, religious gaps. The reality is that some of these issues are reinforced in the context of marginalization, disenfranchisement, and exclusion. So we keep going in terms of the story here. Assimilation was the UK model. Be like us, absorb yourself into a unitary country, and that is England. But England has never been unitary. It's one of the most class societies in the world, if not the. And of course, there was early recognition of racism, and so anti-racist legislation was introduced formally in the late 60s, 67, and was strengthened beyond all the way up to 2000. We've seen some repeal of that and sort of the watering down of the equalities framework quite considerably over the last 2 decades, in parallel with the war on terror, in parallel with sort of the height of multiculturalism at the end of the 1990s to now, when multiculturalism is seen as a dirty word, and it's seen as a forerunner into extremism. So we securitize differences. We don't value them. We don't think that they're an asset to our nation's well-being. We think that there's somehow a risk to our security as a result of these differences. Everything has been tried: integration, assimilation. In France, when people say we have an integration policy, it's actually assimilation. But 6 million plus Muslims in France experience 3 or 4 times levels of unemployment. They're stuck in housing estates way out in the suburbs or into the banlieue, which is 40 miles away, making it impossible to come into Paris to work if you've got 6 hours travel time and childcare duties, as well as discrimination. Secular French Muslims still experience quite palpable degrees of discrimination, which leads to frustration, which leads to a sense of dislocation. And these kinds of problems are then concentrated. Now, the state discourses and some of the majority discourses are, well, look at these people, they don't want to be part of who we are. We were wrong to invite them. We need to now see them out. I mean, we've got the Citizenship of Borders bill in the UK that could strip 5 million people of their citizenship at will. That's 5 million people, mostly of color. We see also other powers to the state that have just become quite exaggerated, particularly around protests. But the fact that we have so many million Muslims, it's a little wonder that we had 4,000 European-born Muslims who went to Islamic State. These are 4,000 Muslims, about the average age of 23. Some with limited or no knowledge of Islam, and some obviously highly strong, so highly strung really in terms of their kind of mindedness about these ideas. But again, it's the rigidity there, the mindset there, which needs to be better understood. But a lot of people thought in some ways that this would genuinely be an opportunity for a better life. In some cases, there were material pull factors. If you could speak Arabic, French, and could use Movie Maker on a MacBook Pro, that's a $5,000 a month salary for Islamic State. Islamic State accumulated nearly $35 billion at one point, everything from selling oil on the black market to Assad even, but as well as Turkey and Iran, and all this is well documented. There's also obviously some hostage taking and all of that involved as part of that sort of racketeering side of the economic model. So we have this sort of global system of Islamism that is being incorporated, not necessarily as part of the migration process, but as part of external influences on that in many ways. For example, the Pakistanis in the UK, they're Kashmiris. I mean, two out of three Pakistanis could be seen as Kashmiri because of the particular concentration, but Kashmiri as in Pakistani Kashmiri, which has its other sort of dimensions to consider. They're effectively Sufis, Sufi Barelvis, and their adherence to what might be seen as conservative Islam is not imported as part of their migration story. It's imported through institutions that in the 1980s, we were having discussions about external funding, the availability of particular content derived elsewhere, particularly some Gulf states, because some of these institutions didn't have capacity or resources to hire, to stock libraries, etc. And some of this literature was seen as welcome at the time. I know today, in the Dutch context, we talk about 50 Salafi mosques and the external funding from Gulf states. It's almost as if the Dutch are about 2 decades or longer behind around some of the debates that we've had in the UK and elsewhere. So yes, it has been an influence, but there's also been responses to that. The events of the Rushdie affair were important as a catalyst in mobilizing what were Asians, retired Asians who had no real religion or ethnicity. They were a category which is effectively a continent that goes from Istanbul to the tips of Indonesia. And that is what it is to be an Asian. And Margaret Thatcher talked about an Asian invasion in the late 1970s, that this country might be swamped if we're not careful. She was elected as prime minister a little bit after that. So the racial discourse in terms of the UK context is very interesting, and it's got a long history. And we know that in the Dutch context, people don't want to talk about race. If we don't talk about it, it never happened. And to bring it up is to be seen as part of the problem. So you have external influences, and then we have all these very strong trading relations with our Gulf state partners, but some of the influences that have been important in driving, let's call it simply jihadi Salafism with the Takfiri bent, are precisely those nations that we don't want to critique publicly or privately. So that there's an inherent contradiction in a lot of what we say and do when we think about countering violent extremism. So that's important to think about. And then what's also important to think about is the ongoing challenges around some of the demographics. So we have an aging majority population across Europe. In fact, birth rates are very low indeed. In fact, the irony is that without migration, many of these European economies won't have pension pots for the people who are working away today and over the next 20 to 30 years. So there is that debate to be had about immigration. And yet we demonize migrants. We certainly demonize refugees and asylum seekers. And that's part of a particular growing radical right, far right, almost extreme right discourse that's become mainstream. So we think about the asymmetry of extremism here. Minorities are responding to extremism and are also fueling extremism in terms of a majority landscape. And all the gradations of different levels of extremism from Britain First, which is a neo-Nazi, all the way to what was a fringe group known as UKIP with their sort of anti-European framing, which is very much part and parcel of the Conservative Party. In the 1970s and 80s, the National Front and the British National Party talked about repatriation and stripping people of citizenship. Now it's coming into law. So the landscape has definitely shifted, and when we talk about extremism, we need to be able to understand that there are a whole host of historical factors around what has happened to aspects of Islam as a result of external factors predominantly, and what's happened to Muslim minorities historically because of external factors. And this is why it's important to think about push and pull here when we think about extremism in relation to Muslim minorities. The push factors are very much structural. Not everyone who is poor, marginalized, isolated, experiences poor levels of employment and high levels of unemployment will tip into extremism, but these are some foundational characteristics that are almost akin to all those who are ultimately scooped up in this particular sort of landscape. There is this idea of the pull of Islamism and the pull of the ideology that people allude to through a belief system, but the push is what takes people there. It's not necessarily the pull that otherwise we'd see many more, and the same as we would see many more simply because of the push factors. So there are individual level issues when we think about it, coming back to some of the essentials around how we try to understand the triggers. Yes, the smoking gun and lots of smoke for sure, but what are the triggers? These are individual level triggers, and psychological vulnerability is also something we need to think about again, but we must be careful about getting into the whole framing of extremists as somehow having mental health problems, because that's how we stigmatize people with mental health. So we have to be careful about that as well. But again, new research from psychologists, clinical as well as social psychologists are telling us that there are things that we can work with and we can better understand around what those individual level triggers are. But the push factors can also act as, the pull factors can also be push factors. And in a paper coming out, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, we look at, for example, Southeast Turkey, where we get Turkish Hezbollah. We no relation to Hezbollah, but it's just the framing of a resistance movement, ISIS followers and Kurdish resistance fighters, all emanating from the same villages, because there are structural factors that push people in multiple directions. And so therefore it's important to try and think about how push and pull can be in fact push in some settings. In Europe, of course, the triggers are going to be slightly different than it is, for example, if we're thinking about Iraq, Syria, where there are issues, obviously, inequality, but we also have to add tribalism, quite a degree of perhaps also militarism, despotism, lots of corruption, poor governance, weak infrastructure. That's why 40,000 people from elsewhere, aside from Europe, turned up to Islamic State. Some were foreign fighters that had gone from one site of conflict to the next, and we've seen historically how that's happened from Kashmir to Bosnia to Iraq 1 to Iraq 2, and so there's continuity on those fronts. But the vast majority, as I mentioned before, were young. In the case of Europe, European-born, 4,000 young people who decided that their lives were better lived elsewhere because, for whatever reason, they didn't feel that they would be fully valued or accepted. And this is also the language of the recruiters. We know from analysis of the language used by recruitment, the recruitment side of this equation, is focusing exactly on Islamophobia. Your country doesn't value you. You don't. Your state will never respect you or your religion. There are no opportunities for you down the line. Your successes will only ever be short term. Come to the Islamic State. We have everything for you: a job, a house, a wife in some cases, and some people believe that and quote unquote fell for that. But there are these genuine issues also of securitization. We also have Islamophobia. Islamophobia is as old as Islam itself. In many ways, Islam and Europe created each other and still do today. We see the aspects of Islamophobia in terms of how it is perpetuated in politics, in political discourses. When the prime minister can talk about Muslim women in looking like letterboxes or bank robbers, and then the next day we have a spike of hate crime specifically against Muslim women, rising by 350%, reported hate crime, then there's a correlation there. And it's interesting when we think about violence, that is Islamophobic violence, the victims tend to be young Muslim women because of their visibility in many cases, and the perpetrators tend to be older white men. So generational difference is important to bear in mind as well. And then there's sort of the discourse that the dangerous brown men and the vulnerable brown women. But first, our objective as the liberal intelligentsia, we need to save the vulnerable brown women from the brown men and then from Islam itself. Policy in terms of how to think about these problems is top-down, state-centric. Countering violent extremism from the UN onwards is all about national action plans and delivery mechanisms. It puts the cart before the horse. It has a unidirectional theory on causation. It doesn't always think about community-oriented solutions, although there are always projects that do that and continue to try and do that. And there are projects that deliver these solutions without going anywhere near the label of countering violent extremism. So we have to think about the problems of Islamism, and sort of, particularly when we think about the far right, as sort of layers of an onion. The individual with their individual sense of identity, belonging, status constantly challenged. Whether it's structural or psychological or physical or individual. And then we have the ideas at the level of the nation. You know, what is it to be in a multicultural society? What is our understanding of what is pluralism? How do we present our notion of nationalism? Is it a civic nationalism, or is it an ethnic nationalism? In Scotland, Muslims born in Scotland feel very Scottish indeed, and they feel very inclusive. Being Scottish also has a strong identity in response to Englishness, whereas up until very recently, the idea of being minority and English, even though you are born in England, wasn't really seen as possible. We've seen that change quite considerably. And that's obviously a generational shift and also a discourse shift. We see many developments in terms of the current generations. And again, looking at my students who are obviously in their early 20s and talking about their awakening or their awakening, as we've discussed in the light of recent events across the globe, in terms of everything from roads must fall to decolonizing the curriculum to how the George Floyd events made us look hard at ourselves because we had the time to do so. So I go to the multicultural problem. So multiculturalism is now a problem at the national level. We're becoming narrow in terms of who we are and who we are not, and that therefore refers to who is included in that, who is excluded from that. And at the global level, yes, the global war on terror still continues. We've dropped the name. The Miliband, as Foreign Secretary, thought it's not useful back in 2007. The discourse still exists. Good example in France. France with its sort of almost fundamentalist secularism vis-a-vis its challenges in relation to Islam and society. We're now in the light of the emergency powers and beyond to shut down mosques, to deport imams, to continue the surveillance. And at the same time, there are these sort of war on terror expeditions going on in Mali. So we've got internal issues, external issues working out themselves out simultaneously. So all in all, and going back to the project, the idea is to think about both far right and Islamists in some ways as mirrors of each other. Predominantly, the Islamists are younger, and of course the far right tend to be older, but there are these problems of disaffection, disillusionment, a lack of power, a lack of a sense of hope in terms of the future, a lack of a stake in society to make a difference. And then all of these divisions can be easily exploited by internal politics, internal national politics, and external influences. And what goes on in the Middle East still affects people's conversations. If you spend time in Muslim communities, people still talk about Palestine, or there's not much left of that. People still mention Bosnia because it was so powerful, because it's so close to Europe. And of course, things have moved on, although Bosnia is back on the map for other reasons today. And of course, Kashmir and other sites of exploitation and oppression in relation to Muslims impact on the idea of the Ummah. But the Ummah itself, the existence of the Ummah itself, is not enough. Certain scholars would talk about the sort of Ummatic transnationalism that's behind jihadi foreign fighters. Again, it's simplistic, it's over-exaggerated, it's too easy, and it doesn't really have much bearing in reality. So what we want to do in these 4 countries in Northwest Europe, and I chose these countries because I'd spent 5 years in Istanbul, so I wanted to try the colder countries. And I was interested in some of the distinctions between what we've got here in the Netherlands and my own home country, if you like, England, and try to see what's happening across Scandinavia. We've got migration, we've got everything from Quran burnings in Denmark and Norway. We've got Stop Islamization initiatives. We see the transnationalism of the far right across these countries in terms of references to Odin and the ideas of pure race. We see the sort of similar patterns of post-war migration, settlement, exclusion, and also some of the residential issues. One of the things that's interesting around demographics is that, yes, 30 to 35 million Muslims in Europe today, about half are under the age of 25, and a third are under the age of 15, which mirrors the demographic profiles of Muslims across the world today. So older European population that is getting older and living longer, but not reproducing fast enough. And you have a younger Muslim population that is reproducing at a much earlier age and a much higher rate. It's not that much higher than as would be presented by some commentators, but it does shift some of the landscape around certain urban areas and urban vistas around diversity, inclusion vis-a-vis exclusion. So we know that there are some similarities for sure in terms of the co-radicalization, the cumulative radicalization, where one builds on the hate of the other and it builds back on the hate of the other again. But there are, that's quite asymmetric. We're learning that a lot of the minority Muslim experiences are localized, and the majority experiences have much more of a national landscape, far more than they had 20 years ago for sure. And what we want to do is to spend a lot of time on the ground, if we can. And part of the design was to look at in-country things like protests, ethnographic fieldwork. Predominantly, we're going to be doing interviews with younger people and older people and actors, policy actors, community actors, and so this is the idea with this project. And of course, the intervention in terms of what the European Commission are always looking for, i.e., the experiment is the public mental health experiment. We're going to work with people who we think are on the fringes of extremism and work on the public health dimension. My colleagues know much more about this, but it's important as part of what we want to do. As I say, we're just at the first year, so we've basically prepared our research instruments. We've got our ethics application well underway, and we're last of the testing before we can go to the field. You can learn much more about the project from our website and follow us on Twitter in the usual way. Well, thank you for this opportunity. I hope some of these thoughts were able to resonate with philosophical thinking about extremism, and given the audience for this workshop. And indeed, some of these ideas that I presented are under development, and certainly I hope to have much more by way of answers by the end of next year. And certainly we're focusing still on questions, literally. And I think the thing about philosophy that's important is it constantly asks us to question and challenge. And yeah, so thank you again, and I look forward to being challenged.
Thank you so much, Tahir, for your presentation. I have no doubt that you will be challenged in a good way, though. So we've got plenty of time for a couple of questions. You can either post them just live, basically, or you can put them in the chat. So anyone who would like to go first, either in the room or at home. Yeah, Qasim, why don't you go first?
Thank you. That was terrific. I completely agree with what you said at the beginning about terminology and the importance of terminology in these discussions. And I wanted to ask you about your use of the label Islamist, and how you see Islamism as relating to extremism. I mean, as you pointed out at the beginning, I mean, Islamism is a very broad spectrum of views, and it covers people who are pro-democracy, people who are anti-democracy, people who are pro-violence, people who are anti-violence. I mean, it's a very, very broad spectrum. And one of the disadvantages, I think, of using the label Islamist in relation to extremism is that it gives the impression that extremism is somehow related to or a result of or linked to Islam, which I guess is something that one wants to avoid. And so I just wondered about, you know, maybe dropping the label or encouraging other people to drop the label and finding a label that more accurately captures what one's worrying about. And I mean, I know this is not a very well understood label, but it seems to me that the thing that is really problematic and what you're really talking about when you talk about, you know, radicalization is takfirism. I think that's the real. I mean, you can talk about Salafi, you can talk about jihadi, and you can talk about takfiri. And I think there are good reasons for actually using the label takfiri, because that really does bring out the link with extremism, because takfir is the practice of declaring another Muslim an apostate. And the penalty for apostasy is death. So you can see how the practice of declaring other Muslims as takfir, as apostates, is deeply problematic, and indeed is very closely tied to extremist thinking and extremist methods. So I suppose my question really for you is this: would you be supportive of that? And secondly, how do you understand Islamism yourself? I mean, what's your definition of Islamism?
Thank you very much. I totally agree with that completely, absolutely. And I think it's partly deliberate in the sense that I know it acts as a hook. It brings an audience to this work. This audience is wide-ranging, from people who have already presumed their understanding of Islamism, all the way to people who are finding their avenues into it for the first time. So I'm not sure that's a good strategy, but I've tried to do it before. It's the same thing with radicalization. A lot of it is sort of state-centric. It's top-down. It's about finding solutions to problems that have already been identified. But I'm trying to emphasize with radicalization that actually it's something very different. So maybe I'm trying to work through the dominant understandings of these concepts as a way to try and break them down from within. I'm not sure if that's the right way to do it, but that's the idea per se. But you're absolutely right. When we think about that fringe of the problem end of the spectrum of Islamism, that's the thing that should concern us most. But most people see that as part of something called Islamism. So in my efforts to try and get people to understand what is really important for us to worry about, you know, come under this broad tent known as Islamism, and let's work through the different aspects, the different terms, the different applications, the different case studies, the different tests around it. So it's to broaden that conversation, to stay within that conversation, but knowing where I want to take it. Is that a good strategy? I mean, I don't know if it is, but that's what I've been trying.
Great, thank you.
Let us see. Is there anyone else in this room or at home? That's a good question. Eamon, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for. I was just wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on how Islam and Europe hate each other. What do you mean exactly by that?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Apologies.
Oh, no problem. So I heard you said that Islam and Europe kind of create each other. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more.
Yeah, that was a throwaway remark that refers to 1400 years of history. Glad you picked it up. In the sense that there's always been an encounter between Islam and Europe from the very beginning of Islam, because obviously Christianity was always there. Christianity was the dominant landscape in Europe, and it still very much is, even if when we think about secular conditions. And the repelling and resistance occurred on both sides, but there was also interaction and cross-fertilization of ideas and thoughts and imaginaries and visions. There was coexistence. We talk about life in Sicily, which sort of changed between Muslim hands and Christian hands for hundreds of years, 400 years, in fact. And there was intermarriage. There were sort of people in positions of power who were not of the same religion as the people who were ultimately in power, and that's part of that landscape and part of the coming together of ideas, of developments and understandings, mutual understanding. And you know, why we think of everyday sort of misunderstandings of Islam, if we pick up the Daily Mail in the UK or its equivalent elsewhere, they are an attempt to polarize and divide. In fact, there's a much greater, richer history of interaction, coexistence. Talk about Queen Elizabeth I and her alliances with the Ottomans to help fend off the Catholics from Spain. We talk about the inventions that made their way into Europe. We talk about science, philosophy, literature, landscape gardening, the architecture. I mean, look at the sort of the St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice, or the Notre Dame in Paris, and look at the arches, and that's Islamic architectural influences. And of course, the fact that we have things like, I mean, it's not of a linear curve, but the Aristotle and Plato and Socrates. I mean, this is the sort of story around the fact that it was buried by the Catholics because it was, you know, heresy to be engaging in critical thinking. So the Coptic Syriac Christians who were in Baghdad in the 9th century under the reign of the Muslims were translating these texts at the behest of the Muslim leaders who wanted to expand their knowledge base. And at the centers of world learning, we have places like Samarkand, Baghdad, and Cordoba, and that was open and fluid, and there was an exchange with every conceivable individual type from the world. So that, and when we think about today's models of universities, I mean, this is kind of, you know, the madrasa system. The word kursi means chair. We talk about chairs, etc., in our own university system. So, and today, some of the enmity is apparent because of some careful forgetting, or rather misremembering. I mean, I talk to my students, and they just don't get any Islamic awareness or history, not even just in religious studies lessons, in history lessons, in geography lessons, and even all the way to advanced study. So there is this sort of forgetfulness that's important to kind of reverse a little bit. But and so while there has been this tremendous interaction, of course, there has been enmity too, and that was more about politics and less about religion, but framed in religious terms. When we see the retreat in the Abbasid period as a result of the growth of the Crusades, it was because the Crusades were a holy war, and the folks who were in leadership thought, well, we need to build more madrasas to get people ready for our holy war. Whereas before it was the Waqf institutions that were supporting science foundations and research laboratories, or their equivalent to today. So lots of cross-fertilization, but also a great deal of demonization and misunderstanding today.
But let's see. I think there are a few more questions. So first is Ina Haq. The floor is yours.
Yeah. So, okay, so camera is not working. Okay, it's working. Hi. So I did raise my hand. I had a question relevant to the labelization. So Qasim already asked, but coming from Pakistan, so I still try to ask it. So coming from Pakistan and working with the young Taliban kid when we apprehended them in Sawat operation, and as a psychologist, so the labelization, like you use the word like Islam versus the Europe, right? It's not West. It's, and then when I work with them, those always refer to it's West versus us, right? So they labelize it as West. So for them, when I try to discuss them, okay, who's the West? And because they're under 18, they were kids, not very much education, they always refer to, for them Russian, for them Americans, for them anyone who has like white skin been targeted as a terrorist. And this is the effect of like they are oppressive, not sorry, terrorist as oppressive, like they see them as Russian, obviously they were enemies, then there come Americans, they are enemies, so anyone who's a white skin. So what we try to do in these de-radicalization centers is try to just show them that not all white skin, that label is wrong. Using West as a label is wrong. But when I moved to Germany, and now I'm looking, it's like teachers, scholars, everyone. So using this label of Islamic radicalization or Islam. And so it's like, I really admire your work. Like but going in this through, isn't it the somehow sporting the Western media, which when American displays go into that direction. But if we drop the label, how we can drop the label? Then it is like ISIS used the word Islam. They said Islamic State. Yeah. Do we have an option to drop this label even?
Well, you know, I mean, some scholars would not use Islamic State and use Daesh or ISIL. I use Islamic State because that's what it's commonly known as. But at the same time, it's it was definitely not Islamic, and it was hardly a state, although it did have a number of ministries and some central organization. But the idea of kind of Europe and the West, obviously we need to think about America. It's a couple of hundred years old, born out of slow genocide and heavy aspects of racialization, which is what the European experience is also indicative of. And some of what, and I think this was mentioned also in Qasim's, what some of the things, the critique that Al-Qaeda have about Western corruption and despotism, there's some merits to that, and that's also valid, and that's part of a critical discussion and a conversation we need to have with all the interlocutors in this exchange. But the thing is, the question around young Pakistanis or young folks in the Swat region, and I had an opportunity to visit Swat in 2012, is that there is this vacuum of a lack of alternative sources of information, the lack of capacity in terms of institutions, a lack of ability to have critical thinking, and it's not because there's something weak or fundamentally problematic about who they are. It's just resources and being isolated, and a long history of conflict in Afghanistan that goes back to the early 70s. I mean, and it's been war-torn for 40, 50 years. It's a rough, tough, and a beautiful country, but it's also had a lot thrown at it by so many different individuals and nations, etc. And there's nothing wrong with what we regard as the problems of the West in Muslim countries. It's what we do to deal with them. And in a world out of the liberal, secular ivory towers of our institutions here in the West, we think, yes, exchange, debate, discussion, reasonableness will take us forward. But for a lot of people, it's day to day, and it's a tough struggle. And it's really, really tough to try and do the kinds of CVE, countering violent extremism type initiatives, because you're not going to be able to change minds and hearts using Blair's language just through debate and discussion and rational and reasonable thinking. There's structural material issues that are not going to disappear overnight. And in this, despite all these kind of short-term measures and some funny money thrown into these projects, the long-term underpinning problems are still there. But again, perhaps it's a kind of my privilege to be able to say these kinds of things in my comfortable chairs, while most people won't get that same opportunity, and not being in these comfortable chairs could even be labeled as part of the problem. Fortunately, the Bastions of Freedom, which is the logo of the University of Leiden, it does give me some degree of comfort. So what to do with the language? I think it's to use it and re-own it. Re-own it in a way to say, yeah, this is what people call themselves. This is how it was described. This is what the media called it. But let's talk about what is Islamic about it, and how it worked as a state or otherwise. And let's try and break it down through those detailed, insightful discussions. That's as much as we can do. We're merely academics after all.
But I think there are two more questions, and then let's try to wrap up. So first is Clark.
Yeah, can everybody hear me, or should I switch off the phone?
Sure.
No, it's okay. No, fine. Yeah, thank you, Tahir, for this excellent presentation. My question is on counterterrorism and surveillance, because in the last 20 years, many Western governments have increased their surveillance. They talk also about surveillance society. So increasingly, governments are gathering information. And Qasim said this morning, this actually leads to more extremism and radicalizes people, if I understood you correctly, Qasim. So I was wondering, what's your take on that? Is creating the surveillance society and gathering intelligence increases radicalization of maybe ethnic groups or right-wing extremism? So can you say something about that? Because I'm really curious.
Happily, I'll try to be as brief as possible, because this is quite a lot I could say here. I mean, Qasim's talked about prevent. What is prevent? Is one of the 4 strands of the contest strategy, the counter-terrorism strategy. Prevent was secret until 2006, and yet it went on. What is that? Yeah, so we had the IRA, we had these problems, and a lot of the breaking down of that was through infiltration, through behind-the-scenes security work, in the classic sense of counter-terrorism. But what happened with the 9/11 and certainly the events of 7/7 is this sort of laziness, Oriental laziness, which is, we can't understand the fuzziness and the messiness of the Muslim communities. We need something a bit more wholesale. Let's work through this notion of prevent. And prevent is now so powerful. There's a prevent duty that came into play in 2015. I, as an academic standing in front of a lecture hall in the UK, can report a student if their beard gets a little too long to the prevent channel system, and then they will have one-to-one mentoring. But all of that will be recorded, and it could have implications for them down the line, not least the trauma and the stress of going through that process and the labeling that comes with it. A paper coming out shortly is looking at how prevent on university campuses is having the effect of creating stress, trauma. It stops people from engaging in sensitive, detailed discussions. That's what universities are for. Nothing should be taboo. We can talk to each other about everything as long as we show respect to each other. If we can't talk about Palestine or settler Zionism, etc., in the case that we are potentially going to be labeled as extremist and processed by a counterterrorism measure, then what is it going to do for our state of minds? It might make us want to go elsewhere to have these discussions, and then we'll go into the darkness of the internet and find an echo chamber, and the rest is history. So that's just an example of the UK. Another example is how CVE policy in Pakistan is creating more violent extremism, because what it does, it sort of, you have this sort of level of engagement with these national action plans, and various groups trying to get themselves to the top table in order to get some representation, to get the status in relation to their own organizations. And what it does is that the fringes of the landscape of Islamist, or rather Islamic groups that are not necessarily always hell-bent on violence, it pushes them into further fringes in order to be heard. And so CVE creates more violent extremism, not less, and prevent does the opposite of what it intends to. So yes, be careful about surveillance and securitization, because it just others the other even more, and it creates more of the problems of dislocation, dispossession, disenfranchisement, and a sense of a lack of status and belonging that are some of the roots to extremism in the first place.
Right, thank you. Well, yeah, is that okay? Yeah. All right. Final quick question by myself then. So it's about the one or two slides that present these push and pull factors and enabling conditions. But I do like the notion of enabling condition. And I do agree with you that there are these push factors and pull factors, but and I know that the distinction is quite common in the radicalization literature, but I'm slightly worried about the terminology, and I wonder how you feel about this. So normally when you're pushed by something, you're not responsible for that. And when you're pulled by something, you're not responsible for that either. You're maybe responsible for how you respond to that. So it seems that the terminology suggests that there are these external factors, so external to individuals, external to groups, that either push them or that pull them in a particular direction, namely that of radicalization. And I wonder that does not increase the chances of us overlooking things that are internal to these groups, partly for which, like right-wing extremists, for instance, are responsible themselves, or Tahiri extremists are different groups, right? So doesn't this lead to a certain one-sided focus on a particular kind of factors that are relevant in explaining the arisal of extremism?
The push and pull doesn't exclude the idea of internal or external. It's just on the whole, external factors help to mobilize and enable the outcomes that lead to problems of violent extremism. There are, of course, going to be some internal mobilizations of ideology, which is self-organized, self-sustained. We know that we talk about weak minds and hard minds. Some of the most resistant to counter-violent extremism are untouchable in terms of counter-narratives and counter-extremism measures, however defined, however problematic they are in the first instance. And so, yes, it's important to understand that that does exist, but the vast majority of cases, the vast majority of cases, we're looking at the push factors that are external to the individual. And it doesn't mean that there's no agency on the part of the individual, there's no action or there's no choice being made. But sometimes, there's a lack of choice that leads to a certain choice. And that's also, to understand and to appreciate. And perhaps my motivation here is to kind of get a better understanding of societies, our discourses around social cohesion, our understanding of pluralism, and our appreciation of each other in a kind of national context that's much more inclusive than it is at the moment. And that's a way into thinking about different kinds of alternative extremisms that somehow feed into each other at the periphery of societies. So if we could do something about societies as a whole, there wouldn't be need for these kinds of peripheral conflicts, because there's much more of a landscape to feel included, to feel to feel part of something greater than one's own sense of one's immediate needs in that moment in time. Now, I agree there are some risks of that, and I think that it's important to try and remain mindful of it, but the evidence suggests that there are significant cases are all about the structural, but there will always be the ones that grab our attention, the diehards, the ones that can never be broken down because of these external factors, because there's something so fundamentally internally broken, let's say, about those individuals.
Right, I see, yeah. Yeah, so this comment also had to do with Qasim Qassam's comments on the idea that radicalization is often treated like a virus, right? So it is something that happens to individuals rather than something
that they do,
for which the agency of the individual plays an important role. So that's why I thought just the terminological distinction, push and pull, can be slightly confusing. But I see that you want to build more into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. It works with all the extremism, fanaticism, fundamentalism, all these kind of descriptors. If we just take them as adjectives, we have to try and frame them in terms of lived experience understandings. And while we can see a lot of it is about the push, there will be some pull, which is just about the individual and their desire to change the world, etc., and bring those along with them that they can. But they are the very, very, very few. And in terms of the kind of securitization landscape, it's much more about securitizing push factors and ignoring them, ignoring the real structural dimensions, which are all important about integration and long-term issues of social mobility and ideas of inclusion more generally.
Right, thank you so much. Let's put our hands together again for.
So I'm very pleased to have as our next speaker, Nomi Claire Lazar. She's professor of public and international affairs at the University of Ottawa, and her lecture today is titled Framing Political Extremism. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Rik for the invitation to participate. So it might be worth noting at the outset that my own area of scholarship recently has been focused on political rhetoric, and specifically the rhetoric of temporality. And so I'm coming at questions around extremism because one of the main assertions in my last book was that that we move between conceptions of the flow of time fairly easily, that in some contexts we are quite at ease with progressivism, for example, whereas in other contexts we see time as moving in a cyclic fashion, etc. And after I finished the book, I realized that that some of the conceptions of the flow of time that I had been playing around with there don't work in quite the same way, particularly apocalypticism. And so now I'm just beginning a project on apocalyptic politics and the rhetoric of apocalyptics. And in that vein, became quite interested in these questions surrounding extreme belief because of the common presence of some of these temporal frames. So that's how I'm coming at these questions rather than as an empirical scholar of extremism or as an epistemologist, as a philosopher. And so what I want to do primarily in a nutshell is to suggest the hypothesis, and it is just a hypothesis. So I like that Rik said, oh, we should be just playing with ideas and raising ideas here, to suggest the hypothesis that extreme belief has two temporal characteristics. And the first is that it's associated with finality and stasis, and the other that it's guided by the notion of immanence, you could say in both senses. So I'll put that on the table, and then I'll present my argument, and hopefully you'll have some good feedback for me afterward. So extreme belief should be understood as a dynamic phenomenon. While certain personality characteristics or social conditions may provide the conditions for its growth and flourishing, it's rhetoric that seeds it and guides its development through time. So my aim is to raise a hypothesis about the role of a common rhetorical driver of extreme belief, the stasis frame, and to illustrate how attention to this mode of rhetorical framing can illuminate both the draw of extremism and some of its consequences. If the hypothesis proves founded, it may in turn suggest alternative frames that can meet those needs without such destructive consequences. The proposal in a nutshell is as follows. Empirically, extremist rhetoric across the political spectrum exhibits a fairly consistent set of themes: a golden age, current corruption, the need or inevitability of a reckoning, and the imminence and urgency of that reckoning, if only good people will do as they ought. These claims seem substantive, but in fact, they fit a stock pattern. They're the elements of a common temporal rhetorical frame. So drawing on my previous work on political rhetoric and framing, I'll show how these thematic elements fit together to form a stasis frame. While some temporal framing is oriented toward process, recognizing the permanence of flux in politics and situating a present moment in the course of that flux, other frames like primitivism and eschatology are stasis-oriented. That is, they give the sense of an ending, a permanent conclusion to politics and conflict. With right order restored and everything in its place, this politics offers the weird freedom of no longer having to act. Recognizing the stasis frame goes some way to explaining the general psychological appeal of extremism, the promise of ultimate satisfaction, the happy ending. It follows the pattern of our most satisfying stories, and it goes some way too to explaining the puzzling phenomenon of movement between extreme ideologies. The draw is not, or not only, ideological substance, but the temporal structure and the promise of the end. And finally, the stasis frame helps account for two features of extremist violence. On one hand, when the very end is at stake, any means seem justified, but not all extreme violence is instrumental. Some seems to be, from the extremist perspective, of intrinsic value. The nature of stasis, the purification and restoration of permanent just order, helps to explain this too. So in what follows, I'm going to review some of the themes that Saussure et al. Have found in extremist communications. I'm going to put up a slide in a second. And then after providing a very brief summary of the nature of framing and of what is elsewhere a book-length theory of temporal rhetoric and politics, I'll illustrate how the stasis frames of primitivism and eschatology work together to undergird extremist rhetoric. I conclude with a brief account of how the stasis frame idea can help explain peculiarities of extreme belief. And then we'll be very warmly welcoming to any critical feedback that you might have. So it's been a while since I've done this because I'm on sabbatical, but I think that if I click this, allow Zoom to share your screen. Oh, this is going to be complicated. All right, it's going to be sufficiently complicated. I think I'm going to just go on without the slide. So in a nutshell, associate.
I could try to put it up.
Okay, sure. That's.
Let me try. Give me a second.
Okay.
Called NCR framing, right?
That's the one. So while Rik's doing this, so essentially what these scholars did was to undertake a massive systematic study of extremist rhetoric and speeches and manifestos that spanned, that spanned different cultures, religious and secular orientations, etc., to try to detect common rhetorical elements and themes in the narrative of extremism. And so they detect these 16 features, which seem to emerge fairly consistently in extremist rhetoric. And if you look at them, they do tend to fit this eschatological, primitivist and eschatological thematic very, very tidily. So there's the notion of the glorified past, of corruption and oppression by some evil force, the notion that all of this is going to come to a head or must be brought to a head in order to sort of look forward to this this sort of future utopia. So the authors of this study claim that it would be useful that a look at these sort of elements of extreme narrative would be useful in studying the mindset of extremism. And they say this kind of narrative helps account for socio-political violence more generally. So in my recent work on political temporality, there are some thematics that may help illuminate why these elements are often present in extremist rhetoric and how they work together to shape political belief and spur extremist action. So existing empirical scholarship has looked to individual characteristics such as narcissistic or authoritarian personality features, mental illness, loneliness, and shame, for example, as well as social conditions such as upheaval and economic precarity to explain extreme belief. But emotions and character traits do not magically organize themselves into propositions, nor does belief directly engender political action or violence. Both the gap between susceptibility and specific beliefs and the gap between belief and action are bridged by the particular relationship between a political entrepreneur's rhetoric and public engagement with that rhetoric. So the rhetoric of extremism warrants attention if we want to understand extreme belief and its connection with dangerous action. It's tempting to assume our attention ought to focus on the substance of beliefs, but through attention to the frame, we may gain insight into some puzzling phenomena. Notable among these, and a particularly interesting feature of extremism, is the facility with which believers move among distinct and sometimes opposed substantive beliefs. This is something which Hoffer noted in The True Believer, and Qasim notes this in his new book also. Because the frame may key the substance of diverse beliefs, we may find there a partial explanation of this phenomenon. So Erving Goffman defined frames as schemata of interpretation, which we employ, usually subconsciously, to organize raw experience into meaning. All social beliefs are shaped through rhetorical framing, and arguably all meaning sits within contextual frames. Whatever intrinsic significance a thing has, it has no complete social meaning before it is keyed by contextual cues. So for example, if we see a person in a lab coat, then if that person is in a hospital, we may assume that they are a doctor. But if we see that person at a Halloween party, we may assume that that person is dressed up as a doctor. If we see them on a stage at the theater, we may assume it's an actor playing a doctor, unless of course there has just been a medical emergency on the stage. So the lab coat has some meaning in itself, but its full social meaning is only available once it is keyed by the frame in which we come to encounter it. So in the political realm, the frame of intentionality, which Goffman described as the most fundamental in the social and by extension political sphere, is illustrative. So we could consider how differently we would perceive a state's detonation of a weapon within distinct frames of accident or intention. The event in itself is the same, but whether it came about deliberately or accidentally, and what those intentions might be, keys its political meaning. It's a short step from here to an evident rhetorical opening for political entrepreneurs. To compel some interpretation of an event in the service of some strategic aim, the rhetor need only change the intentionality frame in describing the event. And this alters how an audience understands what has happened and what ought to happen next. Some populists use this technique liberally. They might tell their people that their travails are not the result of chance or accident or some intricate combination of competing intentions and aims, but rather the consequence of deliberate intention, a conspiracy of elite power. It's not just the substance of people's social conditions or the events which take place that matters. It matters too whether someone has caused suffering on purpose. But the focus of my thoughts today is not intentionality, but another omnipresent frame in political speech, time and temporality. For our understanding of political events is keyed not only by intention, but also by where an event sits in a series, how it's perceived to connect to past events and to an imagined future. And it's striking that extreme belief and the extremist discourses through which it is cultivated, won, or lost, so commonly use temporal frames of proximate stasis. That is, a common feature of extremist rhetoric is that it aims at stopping time. And to explain what I mean here, it helps to step back and provide a very brief account of temporal framing, generally what it is and how it works. So in my recent book, Out of Joint, Power, Crisis, and the Rhetoric of Time, I argued we can have no direct experience of time. The quickest way to demonstrate this is to consider the impact of some cave experiments that are still occasionally ongoing, where spelunkers agreed to go down and live underground with no external indication of the passing of time for long stretches, sometimes for months on end, and then kept a record of waking and sleeping and eating, and would sort of call up to the ground or to the surface where a note would be made of the timing of this. And people's experience of time became wildly out of whack. So they would sleep for 24 hours and then be awake for 24 hours, etc. And they would start to use their own bodily functions as markers of time, so that they could not sort of access temporality in the way that we do up here on the surface without these sort of external markers, and use whatever was available, which in this case is their own bodies, in order to track time. So our experience of time is always mediated through marks and measures. And most of these marks and measures are things that we construct ourselves. The forms that marks and measures give to time are diverse and depend on our aims. So we do a lot of things with time, and we have a lot of tools to achieve these diverse aims. For example, most of us use multiple calendars simultaneously, some of which rest on diverse celestial and mystical markings like the Gregorian calendar and various other religious calendars, while others like an academic calendar result from stipulation. We also use diverse forms of clocks and timers, ranging from atomic oscillation to the arrival of a bus or train. And then there are the temporal measures of longer duration, things like progress and decline. All these different modes of constructing time overlap in our daily lives. If we want an egg timer to make breakfast, but sunset to tell the kids when to be home, and an atomic clock to power GPS. And we move easily among all of these, rarely noting their diversity or the ways our sense of time shifts as our aims shift. The same diversity characterizes our measures of time's flow over a long stretch. That is, we use conceptions of the flow of time, diverse ideas of its shape, to understand what events mean within time's flow. We see a birthday as a mark of the linear course of aging, but also as a mark of the cycle of years. The shape of time frames the course of narrative beyond substantive events, and political leaders habitually harness this in political rhetoric. To exercise this technique, a leader may pick from an infinite array, a series of events, which, when placed in sequence, trace out an arc through the present moment and point the way to the future. For example, a leader whose aim is to legitimate a re-entrenchment of some version of the status quo might deploy a grand cyclic or progressive temporal rhetorical frame. She may claim that after a long series of setbacks or a long series of steps, her innovation or appearance on the scene will enable the next steps toward a brighter future, or that the moment will bring to a halt cyclic decline and set out the nation on a new rise toward glory. So Viktor Orban, for example, is a master of this kind of rhetoric and has long deployed a sort of grand cyclic frame to legitimate Christian nationalism. So in a recent speech, he said, but we have felt for 1,000 years that life itself is a grand romantic adventure. We suffered in the 20th century, but now we are preparing for a future of another kind. We are preparing for a spectacular Central European ascent. And the same temporal frame shapes Hungary's constitutional preamble, which describes how Hungary lingered for a millennium at a pinnacle of greatness, suffered decline under foreign domination, and will now rise again. In speech after speech, Orban traces out the cyclic frame arced between the temporal touch points of the year 1000 and 2000. The frame implies a bright future for Hungarians. Because an infinite number of events precede a contested moment, and a leader has a range of plausible choices in rhetorically constructing the salient sequence, choosing an event set allows rhetors to shape a temporal frame, tracing a line from one event to the other, intersecting the current salient moment and continuing on to suggest a moving or static future. Other establishment politicians like Angela Merkel deploy a steady, progressive temporal rhetorical frame. In her speech congratulating Joe Biden on winning the American presidency, Merkel spoke of defending and furthering shared values, of tasks they will set out upon together, side by side. And this was typical Merkel rhetoric when she'd speak of Europe too. Shared values, defended and pursued, not achieved, not ultimately realized. Now, these two temporal rhetorical frames, the grand cyclic rise and the steady push ahead, are among those we might term process-oriented. The ideal here is an always receding lighthouse, providing acknowledged to be impossible standards to help us assess and direct our mode of life. While a really just democratic republic, for example, is not possible, the light ahead points the direction for reform. Choose the better over the worse, strive for improvement, recognize that external and internal events mean no course runs smooth. Politicians who use these frames can pin the present moment anywhere along this arc, and as long as it points in a general upward direction, this temporality can help legitimate existing institutions and suggest that they are worth saving. But not all temporal rhetoric takes this form. For some, the possibility of amelioration step by step, of endless movement around an always receding future is intolerable. Such people experience existence in time as disordered, not only because of the omnipresence of corruption and decay, but because of the existence of change generally. Things are always coming apart and then reforming improperly. Nothing stays where it ought to be, and any alignment is temporary. Politics is vertigo. Everything sits in conflict and flux, and in this condition, peace and harmony and justice seem impossible. This is partly true, but most of us accept or at least tolerate this condition of conflict. Either we accept this condition of eternal strife as just the way things are, or through the lens of ideology, we may mistake the seeming justice of an artificial order for justice itself, the slowness of change for stability, etc. In these ways, most of us manage and tolerate collective life in the coursing of temporality. But for others, conflict and disorder is unbearable and aberrant. The world and time feels as though someone has smashed all the plates, while all around pretend not to notice or care. And for such people, there's a clear and obvious imperative: restore the whole. Everywhere but utopia is a travesty, and utopia is not just possible, but imperative. But if utopia is the place where everything is rightly ordered, then it's an end point, not a process, the place of arrival from which we would never wish to leave, for anywhere we might go from there would involve decay. There are temporal rhetorical frames that harness this desire for finality, and narratives which invoke the promise of a finished politics, a self-ordering and self-perpetuating mode of life where everything is in its proper place. And such a politics of arrival invokes what I call a stasis frame. Two main temporal frames harness this urge for stasis, the primitivist and the eschatological. And while these may appear to be opposed, the primitivist frame gestures back to a static condition before time, while eschatology is concerned with time's ending, with the last things, not the first. They're intrinsically connected by their anti-temporality. In the beginning, nothing moved yet. Then something wrenched the world into motion, and some massive, violent, opposite inertial force is necessary for the world to come to rest. Primitivism is the view that humanity's original natural condition was one of simplicity, peace, and plenty. In Eden, we subsisted in harmony with nature and her abundance, at ease with each other. Time stands still, and each placid day is like the last. There's abundant physical and psychic space. Nothing happens. There's no movement, no action, no determinations, and so no domination nor becoming. And indeed, the primitive is normally imagined as generic, as a symbolizing rather than an acting thing. There can be no agency where nothing happens, and without agency, no character. And this condition of abstraction, of wide open space, is often understood by rhetors who employ a primitivist frame as a certain kind of freedom, or a marker of a certain kind of freedom. And we can understand why, with the help of Spinoza's dictum, that all determination is negation. Determination in the form of building up or ordering space through architecture and cities, legal orders, orders of time, or in the form of the construction of character or of the self, is a negation of other potential forms of being, acting, building, and organizing. Determination is the destruction of possibility. We might say freedom, once exercised, generates constraint in this way. It follows that it's actualization, because it steps out of the generic or primitive, that sparks the process of decay. Before time, order was natural, self-emanating, and everything was suspended in a condition of infinite freedom because it's in a condition of infinite time. This kind of thinking, this yearning for a self-ordering condition of suspended abstraction, sounds odd, but it's been a pervasive, totally pervasive, wherever humans have packed themselves into cities with complex, concrete, physical, and psychic spaces, as far back as Assyria. Even Gandhi found aspects of it powerfully attractive, conflating nature with purity. It's not that we did not know how to invent machinery, he writes in Hind Swaraj, but our forefathers knew that real happiness and health consisted in the proper use of our hands and feet. The closer we are to nature, the more morally pure we are, the more things are properly ordered. As a notable aside, the primitive obsession with purity, naturalness, and cleansing may help to account for the otherwise weird transformation of so-called granola moms into QAnon followers recently. The true primitivist retreats from politics because there can be no internally generated event, which is not at the same time corrupt and destroy. At the moment where the primitive emerges into politics as an agent beyond the semiotic power of its sheer idea, it ceases to be primitive because it ceases to be generic. But this does not mean primitivism plays no role in politics. Rather, its political function is to show, by contrast with the generic ideal, our own degeneracy and disorder. And drawing this contrast, a political entrepreneur prepares the audience for a more action-oriented stasis frame, which is not an oxymoron, even though it sounds like one, which is eschatology. If primitivism presumes the world was wrenched into motion from its peaceful atemporality, a concave lens through which time opened up, then eschatology and a promised apocalypse serves as the convex that will restore order by bringing time to a conclusive end. Eschatology refers to speculations or theories of what will happen at the end of time. Like primitivism, eschatology in its variety spans major cultural traditions, East and West, North and South, and is as old as culture. The world as we know it emerged from a bucolic primitive past into the time of events, action, power, order, and domination. In this disordered, corrupted, and degenerating world, an evil force sparks an existential conflict that boils to a crisis. At a decisive point, a benevolent strength, together with the rightly ordered action of a group of the elect, will bring about a resolution, positively transforming protagonists and restoring the static condition of justice and harmony. This rhetoric probably sounds somewhat familiar for those who read extremist discourses. And it's compelling because it suggests a meaning for suffering, injustice, even boredom through the process of redemption. Furthermore, because of the way it merges expectation and constructions of inevitability with the need for individual action, it makes individuals feel necessary and important. Kairotic claims generate excitement that the moment is at hand, whether brought by a promised divine power that stops the world from spinning, or preordained course of events in time as a historical pattern predicts. But we must live up to the task which is being put in our way to complete. It's we at this moment who must succeed in eliminating the rot and restoring the natural order of things, bringing events to their conclusion. We must succeed, but we also can't fail. So eschatology always seems to invoke this paradoxical role for human agency. So in the New Testament, we must prepare the world to speed, we must prepare the world to speed God's coming. Or in Marx, the midwife, we must act the midwife. We must be like a midwife to ease the new era through the revolution. So the listener is cast in an exciting and active role. She's among the agents of redemption. And what is redemption if not the resolution of contradictions and the restoration of right order? So an eschatological frame promises the final achievement of justice and right order. And in the totality and permanence of the freedom from any further action, the freedom from further corruption or domination that the end offers, it may seem worthwhile at any price. It may be that most eschatological movements are at heart radical, but that radicality can be tempered by the timing of apocalypse. Those the status quo serves can manage eschatological hopes. That sort of what I might suggest is almost a universal draw of the story with the happy ending, which appeals to all of us, right? So it's not aberrant, and so we can manage those sorts of hopes and that sort of draw by placing the apocalypse far into the future. But it's one rhetorical characteristic of extreme movements that the restoration of just order can't wait. Now is the time for apocalypse. And I want to propose that this insistence that the end cannot wait may be a core and salient feature of extremist rhetorical framing. So to recap, political beliefs, including extreme beliefs, are fluid. When they converge around a narrative, it's generally shaped by a political entrepreneur's effective rhetoric. And it's rhetoric, again, that enables belief to motivate action. Most people, as David Apter once noted, need to be talked into violence. So to examine extreme belief through its attendant rhetorical devices may help illuminate its distinctive and dangerous characteristics. Among these devices are stasis frames, and these are bound up with the felt need to urgently and finally restore an order perceived as natural and proper and hence self-perpetuating. This rhetoric promises an ultimate stasis, an end of struggle and corruption. The temporality of extremism is the sense of an ending. Now, why does it matter that we recognize this common feature of extremism? First, identifying stasis framing has some intrinsic explanatory capacity. It shows why, as Hoffer first noted, extremism can appeal across the political spectrum, and believers move among extremes with little seeming care for the substance of ideology. It's not the substance so much as the shared temporal frame of these movements that does the work, perhaps. Natural or divine order will imminently be restored and aligned with freedom. Politics and tumult will come to an end. The substance of that order, whether it's anarchist or communist or religious extremist, is less salient than this sense of an ending, this drive for stasis. Second, stasis helps make sense of the connections between violence and extremism and illuminates a distinction between different kinds of extremist violence. On one hand, we note extremist movements often engage in massive and sometimes disproportionate violence. If the result of extremist effort is the last new dawn, a final solution that brings harmony, justice, and right order, then most any cost in blood may seem worthwhile. The stasis frame may seem to justify massive instrumental violence. But extremism sparks another kind of violence too, which we might call intrinsic violence. And stasis framing helps explain this as well. By intrinsic violence, I mean violence where the extermination of a victim is not is an end in itself. Its purpose is not, or at least not only, to communicate a message or draw attention, and is not only in the service of military ends. Rather, it's an intrinsic part of right order that this fraction of humanity cease to exist. Right order is incompatible with their continuing to live. Their mere existence is part of what constitutes the disorder of the universe. So we could potentially think of this type of political violence as a sort of evil funhouse mirror of Kantian ethics, rather than use victims as means only, means of communication, means of sabotage. Intrinsic violence, perversely, also treats victims as ends in themselves, in the sense that it is their intrinsic selfhood, their very personhood, which demands this violence. Just as Kant says that the last murderer must be executed, even if society is about to be disbanded, because this is, in some sense, what the person is owed as a reasoning being. For the extremist who engages in intrinsic violence, it's imperative that the person on whom the violence is unleashed be destroyed simply by virtue of what that person is, and not for any further end, or not only for any further end. Killing here is treating that person as, through this funhouse inversion, an end in herself, not as a means only. It's important to note here that we're speaking about rhetoric, and most extremist violence probably has aspects of both of these, and leaders who aim to turn extreme belief into extreme action of the violent variety would doubtless deploy a range of rhetorical strategies, some of which focus on intrinsic violence and others on the instrumental aspects. But consider how, if this is right, it sheds light on certain strategy puzzles related to extremist violence. For example, people often note the irrationality of the Nazi diversion of resources toward the extermination of the Jews near the end of the Second World War. Yet through the stasis frame, the cleansing of the world is at least as pressing as the military victory. Within the stasis frame of Nazi extremism, this intrinsic violence takes on a twisted rationality. Overall, the distinction between process and stasis-oriented frames is, like many distinctions, functional, not ontological. It's practical to distinguish pro from antisocial or dangerous forms of immoderate political behavior. And the distinction between process-framed politics, which may include some forms of fanaticism, and the imminent stasis-framed politics of extremism helps serve this goal. Stasis framing supports exceptionally dangerous outcomes. In turn, understanding this feature of extremism illuminates its appeal and the peculiarities of its logic. And this may, if I can use the word ultimately, suggest more effective responses to extreme rhetoric, perhaps helping to prevent extreme belief from generating extremely dangerous or violent behavior. And on that note, I will stop talking and listen. I look forward to your questions, suggestions, directions for further thought.
Okay, so I have some time for questions or comments. One has hand up. Make yourself known. Okay. I saw multiple people at the same time. So Rik, how about you go first? And then
So thank you. No, that was really inspiring, and I'm really glad to have you on board for this workshop. Indeed, it's called. Maybe I can zoom in on one particular thing, and I take it that it is a disadvantage for your account that should rule out, for instance, mainstream Christianity or mainstream Judaism as extremist, right? So I'm still a little bit puzzled about exactly what pinpoints the difference such mainstream varieties of religion and varieties of extremism. So take mainstream Christianity, it has this historical narrative of a paradise and the fall and redemption. There's a future eschatological state which judged by God. There will be a certain stasis, right, in eschaton, so to say. Time is pressuring, and similarly for mainstream Judaism, the Messiah is coming, or the elect, and so on. So, I mean, all these temporal dimensions, right? So, what exactly distinguishes such mainstream?
Okay, thank you. Sorry, were you finished?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, you got the gist of it, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you for that question. It's one that I find really fascinating historically. And so, in a nutshell, the distinguishing feature is imminence. So it's where you place the apocalypse with reference to events taking place right now. And you can see this as, so you can see this historically as Christianity becomes the state religion, right? You can see it up until then, there are all these speculations of sort of imminent apocalypse, right? Because this is what goes along with sort of efforts to delegitimate existing power or to sit in opposition to it in some way. And so as soon as Christianity becomes the dominant religion, we have all of these narratives, in St. Augustine, in other church fathers, where there's this insistence that part of proper behavior that will ultimately bring about or that will ultimately get you to paradise is not to speculate on the timing of the apocalypse, that it will happen at some point in the future, or that it sort of has metaphorically already happened in the form of the church, like this is already.
Yeah,
right?
so that's what I thought you wanted to say, but then I'm slightly worried that not only the Apostle Paul, but pretty much the entire New Testament congregations, all of them. I mean, there's this idea of the Nahavartan, right? So they all expected the coming of or return of the Messiah pretty soon. So we should rule all of them extremists, and that seems a bit extreme in itself.
Well, I suppose, I mean, I would have to reflect on it a little bit, but I'm not. So if we want to say that there's sort of space between the readiness for this kind of thing, like the need for this type of story, so that space between that need and having the actual narrative, like the actual sort of set of beliefs, right? And then space between extreme beliefs and action, right? That there are these sort of different steps, these different spaces in between. Then I'm not sure, I don't want to commit either way, but that I would be uncomfortable with the idea that people who are waiting for the imminent second coming, I might be okay with saying that's pretty extreme, right? The notion that the world will imminently come apart, and that the state, and that the state is just a sort of a fleeting impediment or else part of this history, good and evil drama, that is pretty extreme, and that we might be able to say that without and then look at, so what are the conditions that come into play between extreme belief and extreme action? So we could say these are forms of extreme belief, and there may be certain considerations that keep them from fomenting into violence or some kind of extreme action, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, that sounds very helpful. Yeah, thanks so much.
Okay, Professor Tom, if you want to go next, and then Claude.
Thanks, Naomi. That was really, really interesting. So I wanted to ask you about the relationship between the stasis frame and grievance narratives. So in my book, obviously, I talk a lot about the role of grievance narratives in extremism and the way that these narratives can also explain why some extremists resort to violent action in pursuit of their grievances. And so listening to you made me wonder how that story about extremism relates to the stasis frame story. And I can see that in lots of cases, the two are very closely related. So your grievances might be grievances about, society's decline from a golden age, perhaps as a result of other people's bad behavior. And, you then need to restore in future this golden age. But there also seem to me to be cases of grievance narratives that really don't have anything very much to do with the stasis frame. So I'm thinking in particular about what, kind of purely reactive or defensive extremism. So I'm thinking about, organizations like the IRA, for example, that was that certainly was extremist. And its violence was it would have conceptualized it as anti-colonial. So it had nothing to do with restoring a golden age from the past or a golden age in the future. It's just about getting the British out of their land. Or if you think about Timothy McVeigh and other people like him in the States who are paranoid about the federal government's alleged mission to deprive them of their weapons. They think of themselves as simply standing up not for a golden age, or not in an attempt to restore a golden age, but simply defending themselves against the federal government. So those seem to me to be recognizable as examples of extremism, recognizable as examples where a grievance narrative is doing significant explanatory work, but not recognizable as examples in which a stasis framing is doing significant work. So I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Well, what I think about it is that that I'm not yet sure. So there are two things, and so I'm just beginning to think about these sorts of issues, and one factor that keeps going around and around in my mind is which Rik raised earlier. So this question of definitions. So so either we think that there is sort of an ontological category of political action which is extremist, or we think that there's that we should be looking for sort of functional definitions. Why do we need to differentiate extremism from fanaticism or other forms of let's say immoderate politics, and one reason might be the nature and scope of the violence, and then it would be an empirical question, and I have not done the work to determine if this is so, whether extremism or sort of immoderate politics that makes use of this stasis frame generates a type of violence or a scope of violence that is more concerning in a way than sort of standard acts of far right or anarchist terrorism or something like that. But it may also be that that it's not one thing. So we could say, okay, are we, either we use this functional definition because it's useful, because it helps us identify and explain, this class of things, and let's call those extremists, or we could say there are lots of varieties of extremism, and there may be several narratives at work, and it doesn't have to be one thing. The only reason why it would have to be one thing and entirely consistent would be for our own satisfaction, our own sense of an ending, you could say, of tying things up neatly. So that's probably not a satisfying answer, but I will say it's a satisfying question that you pose that will require further thought on my part, for sure.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think I would go for the second option, which is that there are cases and there are cases, and what you succeeded in doing is providing a really compelling account of one particular type of case, And that seemed to be really helpful. I also just wanted to ask you, just as a very quick and slightly flippant follow-up. So there are all these people who are waiting for the golden age and the apocalypse, and where they think that once you've got to that point, you've then got to the end of history and the end of time. And I just wondered, what about people who think that history has already ended? I mean, I'm thinking about people like Fukuyama, who think we've already arrived at the final form of government. Where do they fit into your scheme, if at all?
Well, in terms of kind of flippant answers, I said to a fellow apocalyptic scholar recently, if it were not, if the apocalypse were not imminent, we would have to, actually, I can't remember how I phrased it. We would have to invent it. We would have to, it's always the apocalypse. We always construct things in such a way that, this is the moment of crisis. This is the turning point. Or at least there are always people who do so. So because it's all constructed, different people will have a different sense at any given time of where we are along various temporal lines. So there's a novelist and journalist in Canada called Wab Rice, who's written writing this series of post-apocalyptic novels set in Anishinaabe territory. And they begin from the premise that the apocalypse for the Anishinaabe took place with the arrival of the Europeans, so that there's this whole, so that we're in the post-apocalypse. And that sort of changes the mindset and the framing, the temporal framing of what takes place after various kind of apocalyptic moments, alternative framings, apocalyptic moments for non-Indigenous people. And so, what do I make of these things? That people are always constructing the meaning of a moment in time by inventing these frames or harnessing these frames, and that you can harness you can shape the meaning of the moment through a variety of different frames, depending on what it is you're trying to communicate politically or what you're trying to achieve.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, thank you for this excellent presentation. My question is actually on the measurement of these teams, which were detected as statements from militant extremist groups. Because if you look at the teams, they're quite absolute. Like, for example, the IRA, there are all crosses. And then at some point there is, as you look at dehumanizing of the enemy, there is no cross. And some may argue that they were actually dehumanizing their enemies. So I was wondering, is it a better measurement of, of these pattern of thinking of militant extremism perspectives? Should it be better to actually not only, state the team, but also actually measure whether it's weak, strong, or mediocre in between, so you can determine like a militant group is weak on a certain team or strong or more in the middle, to have a more sizable measurement, instead of just saying, well, they're on glorified past, they're on supernatural intervention, which, for me, it's not a bit superficial if you not actually, give it a scale like 1 to 10 or strong, weak. So I was wondering, what do you think of that?
I think it would be very interesting to ask the authors for their data set and their coding methods. And I'm not sure what they've done since then. That would be an obvious next step for me before I think about working these ideas up into something more rigorous. But you're right that this sort of coding yes, no papers over a lot of important nuance.
Okay, yeah, well, yeah, thank you that you agree. Can I ask you one more question? Or, yeah, is that okay? Or are more people waiting?
Yeah, we still have time, and I don't, unless there's someone else.
Well, just one quick question. You mentioned all these frames, but to what extent were there also other not really frames, but like more priming, more implicit way used in the rhetoric?
So to be clear, just in case this wasn't clear, so the study, the themes that I posted, that's not my research. That's from Saucier et al. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, this is so my approach with respect to framing and temporal framing is, stems from the fact that I was working on temporal frames before I started thinking about extremism, and realized, oh, there could be something that's helpful or partially explanatory here. But it does seem to me that in the study of extreme belief and the connection between extreme belief and extreme action, it's critical that that there be a serious engagement, a serious study of the rhetoric of extremism, which of course would have to include all aspects of rhetoric. So priming, different kinds of framing, not just intentionality and temporality, as well as various other aspects of rhetoric. So it seems that maybe alerting the scholars of rhetoric to the importance of their participation in this undertaking of understanding extreme belief might be a fruitful thing to do.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
If there are no other questions, then let's thank our speaker for their wonderful talk.
Thanks very much for your questions and your